preparing to live stream the webinar.
Yeah, I think we're live.
Okay, great. Preparing to enter live stream the webinar. Preparing to live stream the webinar.
Close that.
Okay, so I can close that now and we're still streaming live, right? Okay, cool. All right, cool. Well, hi everyone. This is Achuta Baba from Nightlight Astrology, and today I'm joined by my friend Kat from thecreativeintrovert.com. You guys all know Kat. Kat hangs out with me and aggregates your questions that you have, and then we make fun Q&A sessions. Today is kind of an intense one, but we've gotten a bunch of questions from people essentially asking about the health of the president, who's in the news today. It's been the news of the day in the United States is that Trump has tested positive for the coronavirus. We've gotten a bunch of questions in, and I'm going to let Kat kind of talk about what those questions are, and then we're going to talk about how to handle questions like this in astrology in general, because there's some ethical considerations that we should talk about first, some qualifying remarks about what astrology can and can't say about these kinds of questions, and then we'll dive into some of the actual nitty-gritty of the astrology.
Cool. Yeah, so I think the first question, of course, that most people will be asking right now is, will the president survive coronavirus? You know, whether you're a fan or not, will he survive?
Right. Yeah, that's the big one that I've been getting all day today. This morning it started. And okay, so what are the rest? Let's go through all of them first.
And then we'll talk about, you know, will this influence the election? You know, Trump contracting coronavirus, will that influence it? Who will win the election, if you can say that? And what the election day will look like in terms of the astrology.
Right. So those are all really important questions. We're going to bracket off one thing for later, which is that the election day forecast is something we're going to save for later in October. It could be appropriate to talk about it in a Q&A session like today, but it's a pretty full-on analysis. And I want to kind of take separate time to look at how the transits are affecting both candidates' charts and things like that. So the questions that we'll cover today will be this question about the president's health, this question about how Trump getting the coronavirus could influence or impact the election, and then the question about the winning of the election. I'm going to introduce today a horary that I did this year about the election and who would win. And I'll present the results of that. And we'll talk a little bit about horary and the pros and cons of issuing any kinds of predictions about these things in general. I want to make sure we talk about today as well. And then, like I said, we'll revisit actual forecasting of the election again later in the month with actual look at the transits in both charts and things like that. So does that sound pretty good, Kat?
Sounds good. Looking forward to it.
Is there a way we can see the questions that people are asking on YouTube? I wonder if there's a way to pop up, like maybe you could pop it up, but turn the volume off so we can see the live chat happening.
Yeah, I'll do that now.
Cool. Okay, cool. I'm going to see if I can do it as well, just so that way it's like, we're probably going to get like an echo for a second here. Okay, cool. Oh, funny. Okay.
What are you laughing at?
I'm laughing because when I put on the YouTube stream to see what you guys are up to or saying right now, my setting is sometimes on 2x speed so that I can listen to things a little bit faster. So it was recapping what we'd already said in 2x speed. So I sounded like Donald Duck. Anyway, okay, good. Yeah, people are definitely tuning in. And I can see questions. Kat, can you keep track of them for us as we go?
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Okay, cool. I'm just going to leave that to you. Otherwise, I'll get distracted by it. So which one should we start with? Should we just start with Trump's health?
Yeah. Will he survive?
I mean, that's the only question that you really can ask in this situation that's meaningful, which is to say, because we know that the coronavirus, it's not like he's caught the common cold, right? The coronavirus is something where there's a significant chance that a person can actually die. We all know that. And so the question that I got this morning, and I'm telling you right now that this question is being asked to me as an astrologer by people who are both on that side of the aisle that vote for Trump and that really like him, as well as people on the other side. And I really have to tune out as an astrologer the attachment to results that people have, including myself, though I really honestly don't have an attachment to an outcome in this case. I don't want anyone to die as an astrologer. I think it's really important that that's sort of your baseline, that you're like, look, even if it's my enemy or the person that I don't want to see sitting as the president, we don't want to wish death upon people, and you have to be very careful because you might have a stake in the situation. Oh, well, if I don't want Trump in office and he passes, then my candidate has a better chance of winning, or that jerk I don't like will be out of office. But we don't go there. That's
good, like train of thought.
No, it's terrible karma to accumulate for ourselves as well, to wish the death of anyone. So we I think Kat and I sat down for a bit before we did this video to figure out how to talk about this in a way that would not be, like that wouldn't try to stir up a sea of people getting excited about someone, being sick. That's really not the point of this at all. So, but astrology, I cast a horary chart this morning for this question that I was getting from a bunch of people about whether or not Trump would die. And the question is relevant because we're in an election season. This is someone who's running for office and they've just contracted a potentially deadly virus. And so people are wondering, again, I got just as many people, asking today this question. And you can see it, of course, if you look on social media, who really are concerned about him because they love him, and people who are really concerned because they don't want him in office. So, again, we're setting that kind of bias aside and just asking the simple question, is Trump going to be on the end of this, that, he comes out healthy and fine, or will he die? Which are really the only two meaningful options to discuss when, like in the past year, I've probably gotten 20 to 30 different horary charts where someone has contracted coronavirus and it's the exact same question. Will they make it? That's all you really want to know. If you get coronavirus, maybe someone says, I got coronavirus and I want to know if it damaged my liver, or I want to know if it damaged my kidneys or something else. I've had maybe a few people ask about that. Maybe like one that I can think of. But so maybe there's something more like that. But everyone that I've dealt with in 2020 with coronavirus in my horary practice has asked the same question. And it's been, will I make it, or will my grandma make it, or will my cousin make it, or, whatever the case might be. So that's the same way that we're framing this question. And it is actually a very common question that astrologers are fielding this year. So I also want to sort of defend the choice to broach this subject because it's relevant to what's happening in the world right now, and because it is a question that I've approached many times already this year for lots of other people. So all of that being said, I also want to say that in addressing a chart like this, the thing that's very important as an astrologer is to realize that we are not the judges over life and death. None of us are. And that in death horaries, whenever anyone's asking, for example, just this morning, I heard back from a couple that asked me whether or not she would carry to term, because they had several miscarriages. And, so they had good reason to believe that the baby might not make it. And in such cases, I'm not opposed to addressing the topic of death. If someone's like, fascinated or just curious to know if someone is going to die or if they're going to die, I don't answer it. But if there's any legitimate reason to be concerned about someone dying, I don't mind asking the question. So that's how I deal with those things myself. In this case, for example, I'll share someone asked me if Ruth Bader Ginsburg would die before Trump left office. And unfortunately, the answer to that one was yes. Right. So I will approach questions like that if I think that they are relevant and not just people toying around in gossip. If people have real, legitimate existential questions about things that are happening in the world, and it's someone that's in the spotlight and there's reason to believe they could die, then I will look at it. I just want to be extra clear about it before diving in. So in this horary chart, what you're looking for is basically one thing, and that's it. Is the person that you're asking about going to die? And if there's no testimony to death, then the answer is they'll make it. That's it. It's that simple. So, for example, in the Ruth Bader Ginsburg horary, it was the same thing. Will Ruth Bader Ginsburg, live to see the next, the next president, or the post-election? That was the actual question. And in that case, there was testimony of her signifier going right into contact with the ruler of the eighth house, in which case the answer, unfortunately, was she's going to pass. If there hadn't been any contact like that, then you don't need any testimony that the person will live, because that's the default answer. If they don't die, they'll live, right? So, all right. So in terms of assigning signifiers in a case like this, the way that I was taught is you're going to look at the 10th house ruler for the king or the queen. If you were to ask, is the queen going to die? It would be the 10th house ruler. If you're going to ask if the king is going to die, it'd be the 10th house ruler. Whoever represents the authority figure in a case like this. So the king is the 10th house ruler, in which case that gives us the sun as depicting the king here in this question would be the president, Donald Trump. Now, his signifier is the sun in Libra, which is in the sign of its fall. So that is a difficult position. And we should also note, just something to note is what's the most recent thing that's happened to the sun, and it's had opposition with the lights. It's had opposition with the moon, which is to say that there's been, whenever you see conflict between the lights, that typically means that the person has fallen on hard times or that there's something really difficult or stressful happening to them. This is sort of in the recent past. He's in his fall in the derived second house in this chart, which would be the house of his money or finances. Of course, there's been you could say some big blows for him in terms of his tax returns. That's one piece of news here in the US that fits with his signifier being in the fall in his second house of finances. So certainly you could kind of go down that path if you wanted to, and maybe not, and this may not even be really a picture of, ill health as much as it is maybe the results of the recent debate, which even a lot of his Republican colleagues were sort of upset by, or the financial revelations, or whatever the case might be. But it shows that Trump is not in a good state at the moment. And the simplest explanation, of course, within the context of this question, is that he's sick. He's got the coronavirus. They're saying the symptoms are mild. Of course, one could doubt whether any of this is true. You know what I mean? Like, I could literally be casting a chart for a question that's actually not even a question, because who knows what people say and what spin is out. I don't know. So we're assuming that he actually has the coronavirus. And so let's just go ahead and talk about what happens in terms of the next sequence of events and what we want to see, whether someone lives or dies. The eighth house ruler, and Kat, are you following all of this so far?
Yep. Yeah. And people, let us know if you've got any questions as we go about this.
So the eighth house ruler is Mercury. Mercury is going to be the planet that represents the topic of death. But there's one other option in a horary like this, which is going to be the derived eighth house ruler. Now, the derived eighth house ruler is going to be the eighth house from the 10th. And that would be because we're treating the 10th house as though it is Trump's first house, in which case the 11th house becomes the second, the 12th house becomes his third, and so on like that around the wheel. When you get to the 5th house, you are at the 8th house from Trump's house, which would be another potential indicator of death. And in horary, what you're going to see is whether or not the planet in question, in this case, Trump, the king, is making immediate, unprohibited aspectual connection with either planet that rules these topics. So with Pisces on the cusp of the 5th house, the other planet to look at is Jupiter right down here. So let me just clean this up a little bit. So here's Jupiter, one potential ruler of death. Jupiter is in its fall and often represents the downfall of kings, rulers, governing institutions or authorities, and so forth. And then, of course, you've also got Mercury in Scorpio, representing the potential for death here. Now, what we would need to see would be unprohibited aspectual connection with either of them. in order to bring death about. We do see that. We see the sun going into an unprohibited square with Jupiter, which means that there's immediate uninterrupted contact between Trump and one of the signifiers that could represent death. Now, in my horary practice, personally, I would be hesitant. I am hesitant to judge this just case closed. I think that he will pass. I'm always hesitant when it comes to death. The couple that I talked about, that chart that I did about whether or not they'll carry to term, there was a very clear indication, just like this one with the derived eighth house ruler. And I said, yeah, it looks like it's a real possibility. But I was hesitant because typically the stronger testimony is going to be you need contact with the natural eighth house ruler. But in the case of the miscarriage, there was contact with the derived eighth house ruler, and I just heard back from them this morning that unfortunately, within a couple of days of that horary, she again miscarried for I think the third time.
You
So
think that could be anything to do with like the movability or the flexibility in the choice, the free choice of the individual. Like, let's say right now Trump is going to be getting the best possible care. Could that explain some kind of wiggle room?
yeah, I think so. Like, I think that generally speaking, there and I'm not saying in this chart, but in horary in general, any outcome, I think it's possible for outcomes to be changed. I don't believe that we live in a universe that is, locked into place so tightly that different circumstances, different choices, different expressions of free will can't change fate. However, I'm also not someone who believes that everything is changeable and can change on a dime. Some things are destined. And we've all experienced events in our life that we look back on and we say, there was the hand of destiny, that was the hand of fate, and that had to happen. So, and I think, we all have to die, and there's a way in which we are all going to die that is our destiny. Maybe there's some flexibility in how and when that happens. But in my use of horaries, I think that the more that the chart seems to show a very clear answer, in my opinion, the more confident I feel in judging that the hand of destiny is at work. The cloudier it is, the more that I feel like I'm supposed to maybe give advice or give some options or, suggest a strategy or something like this. Anyway, in this chart, you do have that unprohibited. Does that answer the question, Kat?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So in this chart, you do have the sun connecting, unprohibited square to Jupiter. And that is the derived eighth house ruler. You have Jupiter in its fall, a pretty good natural expression of the fall of kings or rulers is Jupiter in its fall, as I said earlier. So there is something that's compelling about that. However, again, it's not the natural eighth house ruler. That concerns me a little bit, like that. It doesn't make me feel as confident. But the other thing that's really compelling about this horary in terms of him having a more difficult time because of this, whether that's death or being sick for a long time, or it really adversely affecting the election, perhaps, is what happens next. So we have to trace out what's happening with, with the sun in this chart. And the sun's first contact is with Jupiter, and maybe that's case closed. Like maybe that's just the answer, as I said earlier. But then right after the sun contacts Jupiter, what happens to the sun? It opposes Mars retrograde. And remember, it's opposing Pluto as well, right? Or it's, it's squaring Pluto as well. Let me just put Pluto in for good measure here. In terms of just kind of a mundane transit, I mean, look at what the sun is getting into, right? After it squares Jupiter, it immediately opposes Mars. And an opposition between the sun and Mars can easily mean death or hardship for kings, leaders, fathers, things like that. Something I mentioned in my October overview this month. But then the sun gets into the square with Pluto. Remember, the whole time the sun is in its fall. Very difficult placement for the sun. And then during this period, it is also enclosed by the malefics. So you've got Mars hemming it in at 20, and then Saturn at 25, so that the rays of the malefics are on either side of the sun. Now, that could be a picture of quarantine, for example. Like maybe he survives, but there's a period of quarantine that he has to go through, and he can't do his rallies, he can't do his political gatherings. It's harder to basically it's harder to rally support if you're on doctor's orders. You can't go out or something like that. um, you can't talk to the public, you can't do your thing. So this could be a picture of being confined, which is one of the traditional meanings of enclosure. That's literally the name, right? And you're enclosed, you're trapped in, hemmed in between two things, stuck between a rock and a hard place. And I did a video on enclosure recently that you guys probably could go back and watch to hear more about the traditional definition of that. But right after the sun squares Jupiter, that derived eighth house ruler, which could maybe at the best, it means a brush with death, right? It could mean facing your mortality. The eighth house ruler could mean that, you flip the death card in tarot, and sometimes it means literal death. More often than not, it might mean a very deeply transformative experience that leads to some kind of ending. Um, are we looking at the end of his political career right now? That's a possibility. He's down in the polls here in the United States, but he was in 2016, and a lot of astrologers got it wrong in 2016, And you see, but anyway, you see the sun going into this malefic enclosure right after the contact with the derived eighth house ruler. So that is to me, when I look at this horary this morning, after, of course, everyone was asking me kind of, it's like everyone is flipping out about it. And I was pretty shocked by it, to be honest with you. I was like, whoa, that is big. That is big news potentially. Um, but as soon as I, let me put this back on the screen. As soon as I popped up this horary and looked at it, I was like, well, if he doesn't pass, he looks like he has a pretty rough road ahead with these transits that show up in the horary as the progression of what's going to happen to the president. So that's kind of my answer. I don't want to cop out and not make a judgment, but like, boy, you know what I mean? Especially when it's death. I'm always like, even in the case with the couple, when I said to them was, it looks like death is a real possibility here. So, I would hope for the best, prepare for the worst. You've experienced miscarriages before, et cetera. So I always, if death is in a forecast, I'm very hesitant to be like proud and confident about such a proclamation. It just doesn't seem like the right thing to do. But at the same time, I've seen many horary charts that do show death, and this would certainly qualify as one where it seems like it's a possibility.
Mm. I know that timing is something that's tricky with horary, but have you looked at that at all? In terms of like short term, long
Yeah.
term?
Well, in this case, if you were to time it out, like let's say that this horary is saying, that he's going to pass. By the way, well, I'll just keep that comment for a little bit later, something else we're going to look at. But the sun connecting with Jupiter it's just a little over 8 degrees away. So if you go between 8 and 9 degrees away and then use that as a symbolic measurement of time, you're looking at probably 8 to 9 days or weeks would be the most. So probably, 8 to 9 days seems really fast in terms of something big and potentially disastrous happening for his health.
But you
It
can
could,
imagine things getting worse, judging by what the transits are going to be looking like in those days.
yes, exactly. You can see, you have people like William Lilly who would sometimes use these as literal transits, meaning track out when the sun is actually going to square Jupiter, or when it's actually going to square Pluto or Saturn or something like that. Not Pluto for William Lilly, but um, and then you have horary astrologers using the number of degrees as symbolic measurements of time, like number of degrees equals days, weeks, months. So you have both techniques that are used. Just like in tarot, you could flip the 5 of Pentacles and say it's going to be 5 units of time, like in 5 months from now, or something like that. So in the case of the clients that gave me permission to talk about their chart today, who had the miscarriage, they, it was very imminent in their chart. It was like an aspect forming within like a degree. And I said, I think, if anything were to happen, it would probably happen very imminently. And it was within like 2 or 3 days after the horary that she miscarried again. So This to me looks like it's a little farther off, 8 degrees, so the fastest would be like 8 or 9 days from right now, which if you track out is right about when Mercury is going to turn retrograde and basically oppose Uranus. So that could be, there is some shock and awe in the air this month around the timing of the sun literally squaring Jupiter and Pluto. So it'd be possible that it'd be pretty quick. But otherwise it would track out at like, probably almost more like, I guess December sometime, something like that. But at any rate, again, I don't feel like in my horary world, because I feel like I'm very young when it comes to horary still. I'm still learning a lot, still getting a lot of practice. I very rarely make any kind of public or mundane horary predictions. I did for the coronavirus, which we're going to revisit in a minute. But I have to feel like there's good reason to. And then when I get on, I have to make sure that I tell people that because the pride and the ego for the astrologer can be on the line in terms of getting things right and in terms of maybe your own bias in the question. I think it's very important to just be really tactful and hedge your certainty about things.
Yeah, also just don't be attached to being wrong either, which I can't see that you are, but like I think astrologers get that, they don't want to make a prediction in case they're wrong. It's like, it doesn't matter. You can be wrong.
Yeah, that's important. I think the one thing that astrologers don't tend to live down is if you're wrong, then people in astrology, astrologers think, well, if I get something really wrong, then people will think that I'll lose business. And I think that's actually an old model of astrology, because I think in this day and age, I'm not like, like blowing a trumpet and being like, welcome everybody, today I predict the election, like if you invite, as an astrologer, if you invite people into your thought process and let other people see how you're coming to your conclusions or predictions or judgments of what the planets are saying or doing, then I think people, they get admitted into the process and it becomes their own process. And then you understand that you can't learn astrology without engaging with these things and learning from your failures as well as your successes. So I certainly have had enough failures and successes both to know that, both are totally normal, but I'm always hesitant when it comes to making, like these kinds of predictions, just specifically because other people will sometimes, people will someone famous could repost on Twitter and be like, look at this asshat making look at what a crock of crap astrology is. And it always seems like it's the big predictions that astrologers get wrong that people glom onto for a time and use to discredit astrology, which I'm also very careful about.
Yeah.
But at any rate, shall we look at now I think the next thing is like, let's just go back to the coronavirus for a moment. The US coronavirus horary, which I did back in March. And this was the first thing that Kat said to me when I contacted you, Kat, was, I mean, I don't remember. Yeah, you were like, you called it. And I kind of did, but I kind of didn't. So we went back to the coronavirus horary and looked at it together. So let me just show you it. So in the coronavirus horary, we asked like, what will happen to the American people? And the secondary question was, how will it affect President Trump? And this was something that came up in my horary classroom, a live question that was posed from someone, and we took it as a class and we read it. So in this chart, the people are represented by the ascendant ruler, which is Mercury. So we the people, someone asking on behalf of we the people, citizens of the United States. And you can see that Mercury is on the cusp of the 6th house of illness and disease, just about to enter its fall. So that basic prediction was we're about to get sick, right?
And I remember hearing that and thinking, like, it was hard to believe at the time because it hadn't gotten to that, crisis point in the UK yet. I was like, really? Like, yeah. In a couple of weeks, you'll be in lockdown, Kat.
Yeah. That was mind blowing to me because this was early March. I mean, this was March 11th, and it was right around the time where, there was like one person in my county or like something, you know what I mean? It was like and this looked very devastating because you've got the signifier of the people moving into its 6th house in its fall in Pisces and essentially falling on super hard times. I mean, the 6th house in its fall is about as bad as it gets when it comes to like chronic health problems. So, but the interesting thing about this chart was that we had been debating in my class about, as a group, because in my horary class, when you come study with me, you get to participate in decoding these charts, and I'm there with my, my experience and my expertise as the teacher, but there's also questions, and a lot of times we'll end up having a debate about how to assign planetary signifiers, which planet better represents, because there's sometimes you have choices within the rules of horary. One of the choices that we faced was, look, if you want to know about how this will also affect the president, you have to look at the 10th house ruler, the king, right? Well, in this case, that's also Mercury. So we were like, okay, well, the simple answer there would be Mercury enters its fall in Pisces, that the people and the leader both fall on very hard times due to this virus. And that certainly proved true in terms of just how this has affected his presidency, his legacy, the election cycle. It's had a big impact. And he's the number one thing, probably you could say, he's been concerned about since March has been how this affects his status going into the election, and trying to do whatever he could to make people feel safe, to make people feel like it's not a threat or whatever. And but it's really eaten him up. And that's something we saw just recently in the United States by virtue of, he knew how dangerous this was at the very beginning. There's audio tapes that we have now of him talking to an interviewer saying, yeah, this is really deadly. And of course, he was publicly trying to ease people's stress or fear. That's maybe generous, and saying, "Oh, it's not a big deal, like it'll be gone by Easter. It'll be gone soon. It'll miraculously disappear." And then, gradually it became more of a big thing. But at any rate, so we were debating about whether or not Mercury was fitting for signification for both Trump and for the people when we looked at this chart. The other thing that we were debating was that at the time that this happened, Trump had just had contact with someone who apparently had coronavirus. And the 6th house ruler, Jupiter, would be in its fall, would be the virus. Fitting, again, something that proliferates, that spreads, that grows, that's abundant, and that represents something in its fall, something that brings people down or that brings things down. Like Jupiter, I compared Jupiter in Capricorn to a malignant tumor, something that grows that you don't want to grow. So Jupiter's representing the illness, and you can see that in this case, the sun, who we were thinking, well, maybe the sun represents the king, because the sun is the natural planetary signifier of kings. And the sun is coming out of a sextile with Jupiter, who he just had contact with the illness. And at that time, I said, it's possible, based on this picture, that Trump would get the coronavirus. But that was based on the thought that he had just had contact with someone back in March who had it. So it certainly wasn't a prediction that he would get it later in the year. It was a prediction that maybe he had it at the time currently. But in hindsight, what's so interesting about this horary is that you see the actual house ruler that would signify the king is Mercury. And when we had read in class that Mercury, as signifier of both the people and the king, entering its fall in the 6th house of illness, going into the power of Jupiter, for us in class, one of our very first answers is that it looks like it could adversely affect both the people and the ruler. And whether that's political or in this case now literal, that he's literally contracted it later in the year, it's a powerful symbol. And so we thought it would be interesting to just revisit it for a second.
I actually did. I tried to follow your process with this horary the following day with the UK question. What will happen in the UK with coronavirus? And I got the same thing. I can't remember how, but the sun was also made a certain aspect, and I was thinking, oh, maybe our king will get coronavirus.
He did, didn't he?
He did. Yeah. And that wasn't so long after that.
What's his name?
Bojo? No, Boris Johnson.
Right. So, okay. Yeah. So now let's pull up what were the other questions that we had? Let's remind us. Let's go through the list.
The next question is, how will this influence the election if he is sick, if he's going to get sicker? How
right, and sort of concurrently, like who's going to win. And this is a horary that I did back in August, when I just for myself for practice. And I've been debating ever since whether or not I wanted to share it with the public, because I just, again, same reasons, like, I don't know. So in this case, I asked the question, will Biden win? And in a political horary, a political contest horary, you have to have a horse in the race. So you have to have a preference for who wins. Just like in a sports horror, you want to know, will my team win or will the opponent win? If you're asking, it doesn't seem like the oracle likes to respond if you're just asking for shits and giggles. You know, if you're like, hey, who will win the tennis match? I have nothing invested in it whatsoever. You have to have some chips on the table somehow. And so that's the other reason that I was, hesitant to draw a horary for this and talk about it publicly, is because I really want to. I really try to keep politics out of my YouTube channel. I know that some people will find that offensive. Well, you should. We're political animals, and you should use your platform to advance some kind of progressive agenda in the world. Or other people will say, no, thank you, keep politics out of it. I don't talk about it. I try to keep it. I try to keep things dialed into the archetypal patterns and what they require of us in any given moment, and how we can live a more spiritually centered life. And hopefully from that, goodness will come from our hearts into the world. I'm not a perfect person, so my politics come out here or there, but for me, my interest in Biden is really not an interest in the Democratic Party or Biden himself. It's just that I prefer him to Trump. So that's kind of where my allegiance lies. And all of I'll just say this in advance, that I really treasure all of you who tune into my channel regularly, and I'm not going to be getting into any debates with anyone. So I just let you know in advance. But in this case, you want to know, okay, who's like, where's my horse in the race? And the ascendant ruler is going to represent the party that you're identified with. So in this case, that's going to be the Democrat here, Joe Biden. He is represented in this case by Mercury. Now, in this case, you want to look at the incumbent. And I think Kat, when I was explaining to you this earlier, I think I actually explained to you the wrong reasoning in one part of it. So you want to look at the incumbent, and in other words, if the person that your party is going up against is the sitting president or king, then they get the ruler of the 10th house. So Trump shows up here as Saturn. And what we then want to see is the moon, who represents the people, the electorate. And the moon in this case is in Sagittarius. And the house position doesn't really matter in contest horaries. What you want to see is who has the better dignity, who has the better position in the chart. But most importantly, the moon is the electorate. If the moon goes into an immediate aspect with either signifier, then typically that's the party that's going to win, because it shows the people in favor of one candidate versus the other. So here's what's interesting about this, is that okay, so here we go. So the moon is, in this case, going right into an aspect with Mercury. So the moon's very next aspect, unprohibited, is right to the Democratic candidate. So this, again, like in my horary world, where I will occasionally judge political contests or sporting matches that I have, like my team is playing or something like that, this particular style of horary, this would probably be a pretty clear yes, right? So in other words, yes, your party will win. So I judged this chart at the time in favor of Biden winning the election. Biden is also in his own sign and in his own exaltation. Saturn is in his own sign, but is retrograde, meaning starting to kind of potentially come apart, or there's some kind of reversal potentially happening. So Saturn is in a cadent house. Mercury is in a succedent house. So Biden's position looks better overall by essential dignity. And the moon is going into the moon, as the voters are going into a square with Mercury, which would, again, typically point to a Biden victory. So now here's what's so complicated about this. In 2016, when I did the election chart for Hillary versus Trump, in fact, I might have it. Should I try to pull it up? Hold on. Let's see if I can find it. Well, I'll just give you the short end of it while I look for it. Well, you know what? I want to make sure, because let me just see if I can find it really quick, guys. Hold tight.
Lots of interesting ideas coming here in the chat.
Okay. I actually did an election horary for someone running for Congress once. I've had, if you can believe it, I have done an election horary for a Congress person.
Oh, they were asking.
Yeah, yeah. Hold on. Yeah, you'd be surprised at the people out there in the world who ask questions about, especially I lived in Washington, D.C. too. So I've had a lot of political people come in. You wouldn't believe, they're just people. You know, people are always like they're part of the deep state, all of this stuff. It's like, yeah, they're also just people who go to my yoga studio. Trust me. Yeah, they're doing their downward dog and they're interested in, you know, Reiki and like they're just like a lot of them are just elected public, you know, citizens. Not all of them are, you know, I think there's also a picture that they're all like really conniving and stuff like that. Like they're not, a lot of politicians in DC are like just workers. Okay, hold on. Let me just see. Okay, let's see if I can figure this out. Aha, here it is. Okay, let me just pull it up and see. Okay, yeah, here's the one. Now this is so fascinating. Okay, can you all see? This is Clinton versus Trump back in October of 2016. Can you all see this on the screen?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So in this case, what we're doing is the same thing, but this time there's not an incumbent, right? Because they were both new candidates. So I tend to be more on the liberal side of things. So here's my candidate, which is Mars in Capricorn. And then the opponent is going to be Venus, who is in Sagittarius. Here's what's so interesting about this. This is what I find super interesting. The moon in this case, right, is in the fall of Venus in Virgo and going right into a trine with Mars. So that's like a clear victory, right? The voters go right to the Clinton as the candidate that my horse in the race. But the reason I got this wrong is I think it really, really fascinating. The voters did go to her, right? She won the popular vote. But the popular vote isn't what determines the election alone. It's also the electoral college. So she won the popular vote, but lost the electoral college. I have still not found a satisfying explanation for how to see the difference in a US presidential horary between the popular vote and the electoral college. So that's the thing that leaves me with a lot of room to doubt whether or not I'm getting the Biden horary right. You know what I mean? Because it's like, well, it looks like he's winning the popular vote, but as I saw in the last election, this was like identical symbolism, clear, unprohibited aspect between the voters and the candidate that I was invested in, and it didn't turn out right. Well, where do we see Trump getting some kind of decisive victory here?
Do you think like just asking the question, like really specifying?
Right. Well, the thing is that there's some really good debates that are had by horary astrologers in terms of how to assign the electoral college.
Couldn't you just say who will actually become president? Surely that would just.
Yeah, you can, but again, like the rules for how you determine that in traditional horary were like, if there are voters, you look at the moon and so that's how I was taught. Right. So it's basically, it's like all horaries have almost like a set of procedures or rules that you should follow to figure out how to determine the
and they're
outcome.
and they're based on like a system that would be logical, but unfortunately the system isn't.
Well, yeah, because the electoral college is it's different. It's a different way. It's not quite entirely rooted in the moon, which is the traditional signification of the populace of voters. So at any rate, it's just, yeah, it's a tricky question. But in this case, look at why you can see why Trump wins. One thing is that accidental dignity means a great deal. So, where is Hillary in this chart? Well, she's exalted, but she's in a succeedant house. In contest horaries, when your opponent is in your house, it's sort of like they're waxing the floor with you. And so one of the things that we see here is that Trump is in Hillary's house playing spoiler. And how can we see that? Because look at what Venus is about to do. Within 4 minutes of an exact sextile to Jupiter in mutual reception with Jupiter. Jupiter is in Libra, Venus's sign, and Venus is in Sagittarius, Jupiter's sign. Jupiter is also on the cusp of the 11th house. Now, the house that I'm most convinced would have something to do with the Electoral College would probably be the 11th house. I have a few reasons for why I think that the 11th house could stand for the Electoral College. I won't go into them because it's kind of lengthy, but the main thing here is that allies, friends, some greater community or group, something like that. You can see anyway that Venus is connecting with Jupiter in this mutual reception. It's a very positive, very benefic signification in Hillary's house. And I missed that because I just focused on, well, how could she lose if the voters are going to her? And so that was a really good lesson for me in horary that, I got this one wrong. And so now when we go back to, let me just, in light of that, now I'll take you back to the horary about this election. So in this election, you can see the same thing is happening. Moon is going right to Mercury here. And then let me make sure I've got this right. Yep. So then if you want to look at Saturn, and is there anything that is happening to Saturn? And yeah, Saturn's in a square with Mars in the 12th house. It's separating, but Saturn is definitely in a square with a malefic. And what I find interesting about this is that he contracts coronavirus right as that square comes back. When I asked this question right back in August, and I said, is there any way in which I could mess this up like I did last time, where I'm not looking at something that's happening elsewhere in the chart? And I was taking a look at this Saturn and going, isn't it interesting that there's this square to Mars in the 12th house? That would seem to be an affliction, even if it's separating. It's so tight. It's within less than a degree, about half a degree. So it seems to me like there's kind of negative influences for Trump. He's got a fallen Jupiter in his house, Capricorn, and he's got the square to Saturn or square to Mars, and so forth. And so I thought, well, maybe that's maybe that's a sign of something. Here's the other thing. So anyway, the point is that isn't it interesting that square from Mars to Saturn passes through retrograde at the time right before the election that he gets the coronavirus? And could the quarantine have a big impact on his ability to campaign? Where is Saturn relative to Trump's own house in this chart? Remember, he's the incumbent, so he's the king, so he's the 10th. He's in the derived 12th house from his own first house with the square to Mars. Where is Mars? Mars would be in his derived 3rd house, which would be a place of mobility and travel, especially local travel, moving around the country doing campaigns. So anyway, when I revisited this horary today and I was looking at it, I thought, again, just really interesting synchronicity that Trump's signifier is afflicted. It's not like it was in the 2016 election when Trump's signifier had this big bonus despite the moon going to the party that I wanted to win, right? So for this reason, I feel more confident that I've judged this chart correctly, that Biden is going to be the one who wins the election. But I have to say that at the end of the day, if I'm wrong, hindsight's 2020, and I'll probably be able to figure out what my fatal flaw was, so. But yeah, exactly. Which is what you always have to do with horary. I mean, I would say my batting average gets a little bit better every year, and it can't get better unless you whiff on some and then be able to figure out where you got it wrong. So there's one interesting thing that's happening in this horary, which I showed to Kat earlier, that's a little hard to figure out, which is that the moon is going right after it contacts Biden. It goes into an antitia with the fallen Jupiter, its host, its dispositor. That's interesting because I mean, what does that mean? A secretive form of conjunction between the voters or the vote and a fallen Jupiter. Um, it's interesting. We'll be looking at this when we talk about election day politics, but it's interesting that on the day of the election, Mercury is stationing to turn direct after retrograde, and that there's a square from Mercury in the sign of the scales of justice, Libra, in its retrograde, and Saturn. You've I wonder if that secretive like antisha between the moon and Jupiter that follows the vote would imply some kind of Jupiter, of course, is associated with the courts and with law. You've got the Mercury stationing and turning direct in a square with Saturn. Could it be that this goes to the courts or is somehow decided and overturned in the courts? Everyone is wondering that right now. And this picture could give you room to wonder about that as well. But I think if it's a very decisive victory in terms of the vote, that it would be harder for that to play out.
What about something secretive happening? Like, obviously it's like behind the scenes. So
Yeah.
say the vote goes to Biden, but something secretive goes on behind the scenes. And that
Yes. Exactly. And that's the kind of thing that you have to watch for in this horary, because you're getting the secretive conjunction after the election with the fall in Jupiter. And that's rough. Remember, Mars is still retrograde. You've got Mercury finishing up with its retrograde and squaring Saturn. Mercury is, of course, in the sign of the scales of justice. And we're talking about Trump talking about needing to get a Supreme Court justice nominated so that he can win in the courts, because he's trying to convince everyone that it's a rigged election. So whether it is or isn't, I don't, I'm not going to pretend to know. I don't think it is, but
it's interesting to see.
Yeah, it's interesting to see that there's this potential little cloak and dagger scenario that comes about right after the moon squares Mercury with the antisha to fall in Jupiter. So
if you had to call it, if you were going to call it based on this,
well, I would call it in favor of Biden with some possible shenanigans afterward.
Yeah.
And I could be wrong about that though. So like, it's really like, I'm super nervous to even, be doing this one today. But again, like, I feel like people can, if we can all learn from judging charts like this and trying to be, the reason for doing this is not to just get wrapped up in gossip and drama. It's to learn about astrology. So if I kind of have to bring myself back to that, like, that's why I'm doing this.
Totally. Yeah. So what about election day itself? Did you want to talk about that?
I think we should save election day itself for a separate video, because the astrology of election day and how it impacts both Biden and Trump's chart is really interesting, but I think it would take like another hour. So I think we should maybe like see if there's any if there's any like reasonable Q&A that we could look at right now, and then cap it for the day. How's that sound?
Sure.
Anything that's non-contentious, please.
Yeah, it's tough. So, I mean, one of the things is like, how do we know that he actually has it? Can we even believe that? And could a chart tell us?
I think it's fairly safe to say that he does, because of the initial horary. Like, if you look back at this horary here on the screen, can you see "Will the president live"?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If you were to ask the question in the context of this horary, is the president actually sick? You look at the essential dignity that represents the president. Look, he's in his fall. So that's a pretty good indication that someone is sick, even if it's just mild. Like, it could have a cold and it would be like, well, you've for the moment, you've fallen on hard times. It's more dramatic when it's a fall. It's not just a cold, it's the coronavirus. It's a pretty good picture of someone being ill. I don't think he's faking it. I think that he probably is sick. That's my sense. I think, isn't it interesting, by the way, if you want to get really sort of psychological and Jungian about it, isn't it interesting that he apparently probably contracted the coronavirus from someone whose name was Hope? That's really interesting, especially considering that it's a dreadful, deadly thing, and yet there's probably more people wishing and hoping for someone's death than I've ever seen before in my life. I've never turned on social media in the morning to see as many people wishing someone's death. And I'm not trying to be, I know that people are sometimes just hyperbole and just shooting off or whatever, but I consider it a pretty seriously negative thing to wish someone's death, no matter how much or little you like them. And obviously, and so, but it's interesting that he contracted the virus potentially from someone named Hope.
Yeah,
And that, yeah, that there's all these people now hoping that he dies. And we should really reflect on what hope really means.
I think of that, what was it, Pandora's box, where hope is the last thing in that box that's kept inside.
Right.
And the question is like, is it meant to be a good thing, or is it meant to be a not so good thing? And I guess
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
potentially not a
Yeah.
good thing.
Be careful of what you hope and wish for. It's, I think it's almost better to just say, look, it's in the God's hands, you know? But at any rate, you know, another way of doing it would be to say, you want to talk about a deep symbolism. Look at this. So you can also say, you look at the signifier of the person and you look at whether, if you want to know whether they're ill or not, you look and see if the planet is in a sign environment that is conducive to its own nature. So the sun is hot and fiery or hot and dry. It's in a sign that is warm and moist. So, or hot and moist, an air sign. So no, it's not in the correct environment, right? It's in a hot, moist environment rather than a hot, dry environment. So that means that, yes, they're sick. And then you look at the ruler, which would be, in this case, Venus, to determine what the sickness is, or, you know, how the sickness will evolve. And here you see Venus as the signifier of the illness sitting smack dab on Regulus, which is his ascendant ruler. And Regulus is a star that is known for people who sometimes get the shit kicked out of them for trying to do more than they should, going out of their not knowing when to stop, not like getting kind of a karmic pushback after trying to push the limits of success or victory too far. And that's his ascendant, right? And then what's about to happen to Venus imminently? It's about to enter Virgo and go into its fall. So like, I look at this chart and I personally look at that and go, either the cosmos is just jerking my strings because I'm being pulled along for a ride like everyone else is, which is totally possible, or this looks like a pretty good synchronistic picture of what's actually present, that the sickness lies in the heart. It lies in the heart of the lion, right? And that this the sickness isn't. I don't think the sickness is likely to sit well with him. If indeed we have an accurate picture, I think at the very least, I feel like this horary is giving a picture of someone who is about to be very adversely affected by this. That could just be that what's 10 days of not being able to go out in campaign. Maybe that's it. But I think that this there's something about this is going to adversely affect him, because I do think that it's real in that sense.
Yeah. We do have a great question from BJ. Is this the culmination point from the Aries new moon back in March, considering we just had the Aries full moon?
Yes. Yes, that's a totally legit way of looking at it. You're looking at because you're basically, what you're doing is you're looking also at the equinoxes this year and what was getting initiated in March and what's culminating, and how the scales are being leveled by the end of the year. It's always something to pay attention to, and those cycles of the moon that come along with it are a great way to do it as well. And of course, this culminates, as you just noted, under the full moon in Aries.
I can't see any other questions. If anyone has like a solid question about this chart or the outcome, feel free to add them now in the chat.
Let's see here.
Also look at 0-year elections. I don't know what that means.
Oh,
do you ever overlay a natal chart with a horary chart?
Yeah, sometimes, like I just showed you. I mean, I just did that with will the president live, and looking at that Venus, and that if the Venus is significator of the illness, if you're asking the question, is he ill, it would be right on his ascendant. So yeah, you can overlay like that, or you can look at the birth chart, and you can get a sense of what's happening in the birth chart and how it coincides. For example, in Donald Trump's chart right now, he's got Neptune. Oh, I'll just put it up on the screen so you can see it. Yeah, I'll just give you, that's a really great question. Okay, so let me just see if can you see Donald Trump's chart on the screen now?
Yeah.
So, okay, is there anything in the chart that testifies to the possibility of death? Yeah, totally. How about Neptune in the 8th house of death square to his sun and moon right now, right? So that doesn't mean death. Like I would say, actually, probably in my practice, very rarely does that mean that the person who owns the chart owner, will die. It would be much more likely, for example, that square to the moon in the 5th house, you have a child, but maybe there's some health complications, or there's a big change in the company or organization you work for, or you lose your job, Neptune square the sun, or maybe your father or your mother pass, square to the sun or moon from the 8th house. There's a lot of different possibilities. But if you're purely asking the question, does this birth chart show any potential sign of death or passing, or a big sea change in his life generally? That could include losing your job, which is effectively what happens when you don't regain the office. And yeah, Neptune in the 8th, the place of death. It's like the death card combined with the sun and the moon in your chart. So the death card could mean a transition from one body to the next. It could mean from one job to the next. But yeah, Neptune squaring the lights. He's also got the sun and the moon. He was born under a lunar eclipse, and he's coming back into the Sagittarius and Gemini eclipses that were present when he was born by late November. They started up in June. So just as the coronavirus is starting to trounce us in the United States, he starts getting eclipses back in the sign of his sun and moon, and then by the fall he's got eclipses on the sun and the moon, all of which are very powerful signs right now in his life. Eclipses are usually a little bit more ominous, dangerous, and difficult than they are like constructive and positive. So I would see this as probably more of a sign of a difficult transition in his life. And if I were doing a birth chart for someone like this, probably at the end of my list would be like, you're going to die. You know what I mean? Because I just don't do that. But in this context, is it a possibility? Yeah, it could be. The other thing, however, is the theme of confinement and isolation and like that, because you have Saturn, and you have Pluto, and you have Jupiter from the 6th house of illness and disease, opposing Saturn and Venus in the 12th house of isolation and confinement. So even if it was just as simple as saying, yeah, you might have to be stuck for the next 10 days or 2 weeks, or most of the month leading up to election, you might have to be a little bit confined. The stellium in Capricorn opposing those 12th house planets fits with that as well. Of course, those planets are going to be around for the next year. The other thing that he has to be very aware of is, of course, that there could be legal trouble for him if he's not reelected. And I guess it's possible that he could go to prison with some of these transits to the 12th house planets, which is also a place of not only isolation, but confinement and imprisonment. So it's possible that some of those things would indicate that, but at the very least, they certainly indicate his fear of such things, knowing that they're real possibilities right now. So, for example, if you sit down with a client and you're looking at these transits and you say, is there anything you feel really trapped or stuck by, or are you afraid of being confined or restrained by something right now? Donald Trump's your client. He's like, yeah, because if I don't win election, there's a possibility that my enemies may try to imprison me or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. So, yeah. Added to did you have a question, Kat?
Yeah, I mean, did you have anything else on this? Because this is a separate question.
No, go ahead. Yeah, separate question's fine.
Yeah, so people are asking about the tweet that was sent and whether you could do a chart for that.
What tweet? I don't know what tweet we're talking about.
It's a tweet, I guess, that he was saying that he had tested positive. I do not follow Trump on Twitter, so I have not seen.
Yeah, I don't either. I don't follow. Yeah,
but we do have a time. So I mean, if at some point you wanted to look at it, we've got the time.
Oh, interesting. Well, yeah. Why don't we throw it up for fun? Someone has the time. It was. So we'll just put Trump's tweet as the chart, and this is when he announced that he had coronavirus.
I believe so, guys.
What was the date?
That was the 1st of October, 6:54 p.m.
And it was in Washington, D.C. Oops. Okay, so in this case, we're going to treat it like a horary. And essentially, we're going to just look at it and see what we can gather. This is sort of like I'm totally we're doing some free soloing right now. We're totally improvising. Okay, so the gist of this is what's going to happen. And first of all, is people are wondering, like, can we look at that as a chart to see what will happen based on the tweet? Is that what people are asking?
Yes.
Well, this doesn't look good. I mean, right away you can. It's interesting. There's a few things that happen in this situation. You have to also ask, like, how are you going to assign signifiers in a chart like this, right? Because there's a number of ways that you could do it. For example, you have, let's just put in the outer planets too. Gosh, I don't see, because I don't usually practice in this way. This would be slightly more like, look at the inception of a moment when something happens and judge a chart based on it. And I personally think horary is a lot more accurate.
Well, can we just change the time? I think we've got, is it definitely 12:54 a.m., guys? Yeah, 12:54 a.m. in DC.
Oh, okay. That makes a big difference. 12:54 a.m.
Yeah, I think people are adjusting for time zones. And
12:54 a.m. in Washington, D.C. October 2nd, would it be? Because that.
Yeah, it would be 2nd.
Okay, got it. Okay.
Guys, this is on you if it's wrong.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's not good.
Still not good.
No, it's even worse. I'll show you. I mean, again, I don't really practice with this particular approach or this method, so I can't say that it's foolproof.
It's like an event chart. This isn't like somebody's really asking. I mean,
Yeah, exactly. Like, it's just an event chart. But if you look at what's going to happen, you always want to track the moon, right? The moon is going to give you the flow of events. So what's the moon doing? And here you can see that the moon is, first of all, it's just opposing the sun. Like, it's just separating from the opposition to the sun, which is the same thing we said earlier with the horary. Then what's happening is the moon is going to go right into a square with Jupiter, the 6th house ruler, in its fall in the 6th house. Nothing about that is very pleasant, right? For starters. Then the moon within the 10th house, which would be the place of the king, goes, put this together. The moon will go right into conjunction with Mars, right? Mars retrograde, and then right into the enclosure between Mars and Saturn, the 8th house ruler, who's sitting exactly on the 7th house cusp, which is a strong sign of finality, endings, death. I'm not trying to say, I want to be careful that I'm not just like, he's going to die, right? Like, because the first horary kind of pushed me in that direction a little bit. But this is certainly not a good picture. I don't know what's going to happen exactly, but you can see again that what's going to happen is you're hitting a square to a really malefic Jupiter, in this case, in the 6th house, which is a house of illness. You're going right into an enclosure between Mars and Saturn. At the very least, it's a picture again of confinement.
We have updates. He's in hospital right now.
Wow. Yeah, that's, well, hopefully, again, like, even though I'm kind of closer to a hashtag not my president kind of person, but I still, prayers prayers and thoughts go out to him. And all of us, when we fall on hard times, that's the hand of the divine in our lives. We're all spirit souls, whether we like it or not. There's a pretty good chance that at some point we'll be dancing together in the heavenly concert halls. You know what I mean? So I try to keep it in perspective. We all have a lot to learn here, and some of us seem to be on a bigger stage than others. Some seem to have more destructive power than others, some more virtues than others. But I think it's like the Lord of the Rings. Did you ever watch Lord of the Rings, Kat?
Hell yeah.
What does Gandalf say to I don't remember Merry or Pippin when they said, you should have just thrown him, killed that vile creature when you had the chance, or I should have just killed him when I had the chance, or something like that. And Gandalf says, do you remember the quote?
No.
He says something like, be careful not to deal in death and judgment. You can't see the ends of all people. You can't understand what may come of someone's character, what way in which the road may take them. And God, if that's not the advice that we need as people in the political arena, we need that every day in our lives, to remember that about the people that we find unbearable that we live with, or that we know in our families, or whatever.
I also think it's just like comforting and humbling to see everything as like from the mundane little frustrations in my own life to these like big important world events equally being treated as equal by the planets and stars.
Yeah, I mean, they'll give just as much detailed, interesting information about a missing pen if you're looking for one, So there's a parable, I think, in the Bible, the parable of the lost coin. I think that's what it's called. And there's the allusion to the mustard seed that is made as well. And that, there's not a grain of sand in the universe that is not perfectly and beautifully made and watched over and guided. And so let's just remember that today, especially because I know that this talk could be triggering for people in different ways. And my intention is to try to be a good astrologer. And I'm willing and open to getting it wrong. You know what I mean? Aside from my political investments. And so hopefully you found this to be soulful and interesting on that level. And, if you're someone who has a different horse in the race than I do, much love and respect. So anything else we want to do before we end today?
No, I'm seeing hashtag Gandalf for president. I am all in favor of that.
Absolutely. Kat's been in my classes. Don't forget that my new class, Ancient Astrology for the Modern Mystic, is coming up on November 14th. There's still room to sign up if you want to. It's a 1-year program in Hellenistic astrology. It prepares you to study horary and to take my year 2 class where more advanced predictive techniques are studied and practiced. There's need-based tuition if you need it. There is an early bird payment that you save $500 off with, and payment plans if you need them. So we try to be really accessible for people, especially if you're struggling, your finances are taking a hit at all due to COVID-19. Feel free to take advantage of the need-based tuition too. So you can find all of that at nightlightastrology.com, and you can email me at info@nightlightastrology.com. You can also check Kat out at thecreativeintrovert.com. And one of these days soon, I'm probably going to hop on and come and chat with Kat on her podcast, which will be really cool. And Kat also does good astrology updates on Instagram and her podcast as well. So be sure to check those out. And thanks for being here again today, Kat.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for doing this. It's great.
All right, take it easy, everyone. We hope you have a great weekend. Bye.